My great-grandmother Agnes Caldwell walked across the plains when she was only 9 years old, only to be stranded in a brutal Wyoming snowstorm. Somehow, she and her single mother managed to survive. I've always carried that story with me as a reminder of the physical strength and perseverance women are capable of. And it's one of the reasons I've always been fascinated by how differently men and women's bodies respond to physical challenges. When scientists do the research, they really aren't looking to see if one group's stronger or fitter. They're really looking at the ways men and women uniquely adapt to exercise. We know that men and women can train at the same intensity but see different results, because underneath their muscles, metabolism, and hormones adapt in surprisingly different ways. For example, who do you think burns more fat during cardio, men or women? Post your answer in the comments and keep listening to find out. Hi, I'm Dr. Jake, and today we're looking at what the science actually shows about the biological differences between men and women when it comes to exercise programs and outcomes. Despite what some men may think, these differences aren't about superiority. They're about physiology. Understanding them helps tailor training, recovery, and nutritional strategies to get the best possible results for each individual, something my great-grandmother or many other pioneers had to figure out for themselves. Luckily, we have science to guide us, so let's break down what we know. On average, men have greater total muscle mass, a greater percentage of type 2 or fast-twitch fibers, and lower body fat percentages compared to women. Women generally have higher percent body fat, often distributed around the hips and thighs, and a smaller proportion of total body weight is lean tissue. Cardiovascularly, men tend to have greater oxygen delivery per heartbeat due to higher hemoglobin levels and larger hearts, which surprises most women. Women tend to have smaller heart chambers and lower VO2 max scores, typically 15 to 20% lower than men when both are trained to similar levels. However, these are averages. Individual variation is wide, and many women outperform men at lower fitness or training levels. Several key biological features explain these baseline distinctions. First, hormones. Testosterone promotes muscle protein synthesis and larger muscle fiber size. Estrogen, meanwhile, supports less muscle damage and inflammation, fat metabolism, and connective tissue protection. Second, body composition. Testosterone also influences muscle hypertrophy and bone density. Estrogen favors fat storage, particularly for reproductive function. Third, fuel utilization. During moderate endurance exercise, women tend to proportionally use more fat as fuel, while men rely more on carbohydrate metabolism. Fourth, neuromuscular characteristics. Men often exhibit greater muscular force output, but when strength is normalized to cross-sectional area or the absolute amount of muscle mass, those strength differences between men and women largely disappear. In other words, women are equally as strong as men when based on the amount of muscle mass. And fifth, cardiovascular function. Women's smaller hearts means a slightly higher heart rate of the same workload to maintain cardiac output. Let me be clear, these physiological differences do not dictate capability, but rather influence how exercise should be prescribed and what outcomes can be expected. Speaking of training adaptations and outcomes, when men and women engage in the same training programs, their relative improvements are remarkably similar. Meta-analyses show that men and women gain muscle and strength at the same relative rates. Even though men start out with more muscle, numerous studies all confirm that women's muscles adapt just as effectively to resistance training as men's. Men often start stronger due to higher baseline muscle mass, but women's improvements as a percentage sometimes match or exceed men's. In other words, absolute muscle strength may favor men, but women show similar improvements relative to their starting point. With aerobic training, men generally achieve higher absolute VO2 max increases because of greater cardiac size and hemoglobin mass. However, when men and women perform the same amount of exercise, large population studies, including a 2024 analysis, show that women often gain equal or greater reductions in heart disease and all-cause mortality from the same exercise dose. Even a recent study found that in men and women who both did 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise per week, the women had a 22% lower risk of developing coronary heart disease. When it comes to combining endurance and resistance exercise, both sexes benefit. A recent meta-analysis of 59 studies found that women did not show the typical interference effect for lower body strength with concurrent training, whereas men exhibited a small but statistically significant blunting of lower body strength. Meanwhile, endurance adaptations appear to be unaffected by sex in that analysis. What about after exercise? Research suggests that estrogen helps stabilize muscle cell membranes and reduce inflammation after exercise, which can better protect the muscles during exercise and enhance recovery, and limit soreness, particularly during the late follicular phase when estrogen peaks. Testosterone primarily drives protein synthesis, giving men an advantage in the rate of muscle remodeling after intense training. Now, these physiological differences influence practical adjustments to training design. For one, it's important to compare your progress as a percentage of your baseline performance, not an absolute load or speed. Everybody comes to physical performance with different starting points and genetics. So don't compare yourself to others, but from where you started. For example, when measured by percentage of improvement, men and women tend to show similar gains in strength and endurance. 2. It's okay if your program looks different from others. While both sexes benefit from resistance training 2 to 4 times per week, women may respond especially well to higher training volumes of moderate loads. The higher estrogen may allow them to tolerate more repetitions or sets per muscle group each week without overtraining. Together, this evidence supports programming slightly higher set counts or session frequencies for women, provided the intensity is moderate and recovery is monitored. It's also worth noting that upper body strength differences between men and women are typically greater than those seen in the lower body. Therefore, women often benefit from slightly higher upper body training volume. That might mean an extra set or 2 per exercise, or an additional session per week. When it comes to aerobic exercise, women have slightly greater rates of fat oxidation and lower carbohydrate utilization during submaximal exercise. This means they may benefit from emphasizing longer, moderate intensity aerobic sessions during endurance training. Men may respond better to shorter high-intensity intervals that tap into their heightened carbohydrate metabolism. As for recovery strategies, women may experience variable strength and energy levels across the menstrual cycle. Adjusting intensity and recovery during low-energy early follicular and late luteal phases can help maintain consistency. For men, especially with age, prioritizing recovery and monitoring testosterone can make a big difference. Regular strength training, adequate sleep, balanced nutrition, and stress management all help maintain healthy hormone levels and long-term performance. Now, some nutritional considerations. Protein intake recommendations are similar for both sexes because they're adjusted for body weight. Around 1.6 to 2.6 grams per kilogram per day for those engaged in regular resistance training. Iron intake of 18 milligrams per day is particularly important for premenopausal women due to menstrual losses. Men and postmenopausal women only need 8 milligrams per day. However, active women, particularly those doing endurance training, may need slightly higher amounts to maintain healthy hemoglobin levels and oxygen carrying capacity. Consult with your physician. Now let's look at behavioral motivational factors. Research shows that women are more likely to exercise for health, stress relief, and weight management, while men often cite strength, competition, and performance goals. And these patterns are consistent across different studies. Recognizing what motivates each person, whether it's health or competition, helps tailor programs that improve long-term consistency and adherence. Okay, time to bust some myths. Myth 1. Women shouldn't lift heavy weights. Research consistently shows women benefit from heavy resistance training and will not develop excessive muscle without extreme training, diet strategies, and a little extra help from a pill or syringe. Myth 2. Men will always be less flexible than women, even if they stretch. Men are typically less flexible on average, but this is not a permanent biological limit. The difference is due in part to muscle stiffness and tendon compliance. A couple of things that can definitely be improved with a little effort. Myth 3. Men and women should train differently. The same core principles apply. Progressive overload, consistency, recovery, and proper nutrition. But small adjustments can optimize results. Myth 4. Women respond more slowly to exercise. Relative gains in strength, endurance, and metabolic health are comparable between sexes when programs are matched for effort and duration. Now let's pull it all together. The key takeaways are that men generally begin with higher muscle mass and aerobic capacity, but women often display greater fatigue resistance, less muscle damage, and equal relative gains from training. Also, training should account for hormonal fluctuations, recovery patterns, and individual goals, rather than relying on one uniform program. But the real takeaway isn't that one sex trains harder or better. It's that physiology guides what works best. When you know the patterns in strength, endurance, and recovery, you can personalize your approach and make every session count. For example, men often thrive with higher loads and longer rests to match their muscle mass and recovery needs. Women typically respond best to moderate loads, higher total volume, and endurance work that aligns with their natural resistance to fatigue and energy patterns. But no matter who you are, the foundations remain the same. Progressive overload, smart recovery, and good nutrition. When you know how your body works, you can shape your training, set realistic expectations, and stay motivated for the long run. Click like and subscribe and share with someone who could benefit from knowing these differences. Thanks for watching, and as always, my answers come from peer-reviewed research.